Good morning, everyone. We're pausing for just a minute to let everyone enter the virtual briefing room, and we'll get started shortly. Good morning. We're just waiting as folks enter the virtual briefing room. All right, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest Duke University media briefing. I'm Amanda Soliday with University Communications, and today we'll be talking about this year's hurricane season. It's been quiet so far, but we are now entering the period that is normally most active for hurricanes. And due to climate change, we are seeing a pattern of more intense and frequent storms. With us today to help understand some of the community level concerns, with hurricanes are Professors Lee Ferguson and Megan Mullen. Lee Ferguson is an environmental chemist and one of the lead scientists investigating the Cape Fear's Gen X contamination. He studies the effects of flooding and the potential for contamination from chemical plants, hog farms, and sewer treatment systems. That's a mouthful. Welcome, Lee.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Megan Mullen is a professor of environmental politics. She researches the politics of climate change, including local political response to climate risks. Professor Mullen has published broadly in political science, public administration, and general science outlets. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, let's get started with our opening questions. We'll have time for Q&A shortly. Megan Mullen, I'd like to start with you. What have been some of the recent trends you've seen in terms of political will to plan effectively for hurricanes in North Carolina communities?
Thanks. We do see a lot of progress in planning for hurricanes. We're seeing more organizational preparation at the community level, more clearly defined lines of authority, local positions that have been designated in advance rather than after the fact, pointing to the assistant fire chief and saying you're in charge. More regional planning and cooperation across localities, more integration with land use planning, for example, and with water resources and other kinds of infrastructure planning. So we have seen, especially after the string of hurricanes over the last 5 years with major impacts, right? Matthew, Florence, Dorian. After this string, we're seeing communities think about this possibility in advance. And they're also thinking about the future and how they want to do things. But there's a lot that stands in the way of that future thinking. There are financial constraints that affect different communities differently. Some communities have much more financial and organizational capacity to address these issues. There are complex permitting processes. There are other priorities that arise in communities, right? A pandemic hits and suddenly, all the community resources and the community planning has to be redirected toward a new crisis. And so you get the most response when you can engage local elected officials, right? The real kind of critical decision makers who are in touch with the public in communities, but their attention gets pulled elsewhere, especially with these other kinds of crises. The last thing I'll say is, we catch people's attention the most when we're immediate post-storm, right? That's when everybody wants to talk about, what are we going to do next? And how are we going to recover? But often we don't make the best decisions at those moments in time, right? In the race to recover and rebuild, we'll make decisions in communities that interfere with resilience for future storms.
Excellent, thank you. We'll definitely come back to some of those points. Thanks for setting the table for us. Lee Ferguson, the next question's for you. As we mentioned earlier, you researched the spread of contaminants in watersheds like Gen X and the Cape Fear River. Can you help us understand how hurricanes spread pollution?
Sure, glad to. Right, so North Carolina is pretty interesting from a contaminant source standpoint. You mentioned Gen X, for example. That's one specific case of pollution coming from an industrial source into our waterways, but there are many others. So certainly per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances, PFAS, that's one major concern right now. These have multiple sources, everything from industrial input in the state to military activities, firefighting foams used both on military bases as well as municipal firefighting agencies. But then also there's a number of other sources of contaminants that are important, especially in the coastal plain of North Carolina. So for example, hog farms and basically industrial agriculture, that's one major concern, but also the population itself. So human wastewater. So wastewater coming from municipal sources can be a significant source. So now, of course, these are contaminant sources that are active almost all the time. So there's always at least low-level inputs of these sources into our waterways. So what's unique when we have hurricanes? Well, so hurricanes, there's a number of different aspects here. Certainly, there's the flooding aspect, and this was a major issue during Hurricane Florence. It was, I think, the wettest hurricane that we've ever had in North Carolina. And so what happens under those circumstances is that we have areas of our landscape that are normally dry, that are inundated completely with floodwaters. And so what this serves to do is mobilize contaminants into our waterways that would otherwise not have the routes or the mechanisms for discharge. Okay, so examples of that might be warehouses or industries that might be flooded and mobilize things like oil or other kinds of industrial contaminants into our waterways. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism that we found is that oftentimes wastewater treatment plants are situated in low-lying areas, and this is by design because of sort of the downhill flow of wastewater. It makes it easier to collect that wastewater. However, that presents a risk when we have flooding events, when you have inundation of these wastewater treatment facilities, and then you have both a massive amount of wastewater coming to those plants, as well as inundation of the treatment systems, and so you can have discharge that way. The final point that I would put out there as sources is stormwater. So the stormwaters that we typically deal with are relatively low volume and localized. But when we have something like a large-scale hurricane that impacts most of the eastern part of the state, then you have mobilization of stormwater on a large scale and a large amount of volume carrying a large burden of contaminants into our waterways. And so this has sort of a double-edged sword. We have mobilization of contaminants, but we also have a large volume of water, which serves to dilute those contaminants. So that's kind of I guess, to set the stage, those are the primary concerns that we start with from a water quality standpoint when hurricanes hit the state.
Excellent, thank you. I want to stick with you for just a moment. Are we seeing areas that are having more trouble with this contamination flow that you're describing within the state? Is it something in every community, or are we seeing pockets of it? Could you describe that a bit for us?
Sure. I mean, I think it's evident that Eastern North Carolina has borne the brunt of many of these hurricanes, both from sort of a cost standpoint as well as from a contamination standpoint. Certainly, low-lying communities that are along our rivers are at significant risk. One example, during Hurricane Florence, we observed really significant flooding around the Trent River, so near New Bern. And then also down the Cape Fear River from Fayetteville east to Wilmington. These, of course, we had major floodwaters that damaged property, but also those are major routes of pollution during the basically flow, the hydrology and the flow from the inundated areas out into the major waterways and then eventually to the ocean. So really, these problems can really manifest themselves in any communities that are impacted by floodwaters, but in particular, those small communities that are alongside our waterways are really at risk.
Thank you for that. Now we'll take questions. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance. You can also pose questions through the Q&A window at any time. And thank you to everyone watching on YouTube. So Megan, I want to come back to something you mentioned in your introduction. You mentioned folks rallying after a storm to help rebuild. I'm thinking of COVID fatigue. Over time, is there storm fatigue? Is this something some communities are like, oh yeah, another hurricane? Could you talk about that a little bit for us?
There is storm fatigue, but how it manifests, right, is to reinforce this, natural tendency we have to try to recover, right? To try to restore some sense of normalcy, to try to come back to something that's comfortable. And in that race to recover and to restore that normalcy, we lock in old ways of doing things, right? And so in between storms, you get, I've been part of an initiative. It's called Seacoast. It's a collaboration across multiple universities at the coast in North Carolina, as well as UNC and Duke. And we've been talking with coastal stakeholders, coastal residents about how they're thinking about the future. And in between storms, they talk a lot about taking different paths. They want to, use living shorelines instead of bulkheads for protecting land and properties from the water. They want to change their septic standards in order not only to deal with severe storms, but also to deal with the ongoing sort of chronic flooding that's happening with sea level rise. But those kinds, they want to think creatively about infrastructure decisions and what they should be doing with their roads and what they should be doing with, those communities that have, wastewater treatment and sewage systems and drinking water systems. They want to think about making those more resilient and designing them a little bit differently so they can withstand future storms. But when the storm hits, those plans and those creative ideas tend to go out the window because they really just want to get the road back in order to be able to access essential services. They just want to be able to clear the sand as quickly as possible so they can get back to school and get access to critical healthcare facilities. They need to be able to move back into safe structures, right? And have a place to live. And doing things differently slows all that down. And so what happens is we rebuild, and we rebuild in ways that lock in the old ways of doing things. And especially once you start talking about larger investments in infrastructure, whether it's infrastructure to protect properties, right, to rebuild protective walls, or infrastructure for critical local services, we're doing it in ways that then drive future development, drive future decision making that continues to be not resilient. And so it's a real challenge to think about how we can do the critical work of letting people recover after a storm, but do it in a way during that that window of opportunity, to do it in a way that carves out a new future.
Thank you. It seems like a lot of other things where we take shortcuts in the near term and their long-term disadvantages.
Yeah, that's right.
Lee, I wanted to come back to contaminants for a moment. Thinking of this near-term, long-term aspect, how long does it take for water supply to be cleaned up after a hurricane? I imagine it can vary a bit depending on the contaminant, but could you describe that for us?
Sure. It certainly can vary depending not only on the contaminant, but also on the scale of the event. So for small scale flooding, we're talking about matters of days for the water systems to clear out in terms of flowing rivers. But for something like Hurricane Florence, for example, where we had major inundation, that's weeks to months, really, because you've got not only the flow of the water, but also you have to deal with the suspended particulates, which perhaps might be contaminated. And so those actually, that's actually a much more difficult problem to solve, because contaminated sediments that might be suspended or mobilized during a large-scale storm event, those can actually be deposited in areas that might have been pristine previously. And so the implications of that are that when successive storm events or other sorts of disturbances happen, then those contaminants can get remobilized. So they get resuspended into the water supply, and you can actually recontaminate the water during that event. So, so there's this interplay between the bedded sediments and the overlying water. But in general, the large amounts of water that are typical for these extreme flooding events, like Hurricane Florence, for example, mean that there's a lot of dilution and a lot of contaminant input. So really, over, for example, with Florence, we saw the peak of the flooding and then sort of a decline in flooding over a period of about 2 weeks. And so we actually went back to some of the same sample sites that we collected water samples from during the height of the flooding. We went back about a month later, and we had seen that not only had the baseline flows returned to relative normal, the contaminant levels actually in some cases had gone back to a more normal state, such that in some cases they went down because of sort of the plug of contamination that had passed. But in some cases, the contamination concentrations actually went up because, of course, we've got a lower volume of water after the storm has passed. Okay, and so that's sort of speaks to some of the complexities around these storm events and contaminant mobilization.
Definitely. I want to stick with you for just a moment and go back to 1996. So after the waste overflows from Hurricane Fran, what's been done to tighten up regulations and practices on hog farms? What changes have you seen?
Sure, that's a really good question. Hurricane Fran back in the mid-90s was really, I think, a wake-up call, not only here in North Carolina, but nationwide, about the potential for large-scale agriculture to be a source of pollution, and specifically the hog waste. And so now, when you think about hog waste and other kind of industrial agriculture practices, there's a few different concerns related to releases. Obviously, there's potential for pathogens. One of the major concerns is basically the biological and chemical oxygen demand that comes with a huge amount of organic matter that's released to the waterways. That can lead to blooms of bacteria and algae, which then cause fish kills. And then, of course, there's pollution from the specific organic contaminants, things like antibiotics and other kinds of additives and hormones that are given to the animals. So what we, I think, have seen is certainly there's a lot more attention paid in the scientific as well as the regulatory community to this issue since '96. And so if you look at what happened during Hurricane Florence, I think it was actually striking that we saw, obviously some inundation and some sort of hog waste lagoons that were certainly releasing contaminants into the waterways, but it was not on the scale that we saw back during Hurricane Fran. And so I think there's still some questions as to why that is. Anecdotally, my impressions from my limited research on this are that the practices of the farmers have become more resilient. So obviously this is bad for the farmers as well when their farms are inundated and their lagoons are washed out and they lose animals. So I think there's been a move to locate these lagoons in areas that are more flood resistant in some cases, as well as protections being put in place ahead of time, moving the animals out of harm's way during the flooding. I think that that's happened from the standpoint of the farmers. And then on the regulatory side, certainly when these storms and flood events become imminent, the environmental agencies are paying very, very close attention to the potential for release. And so this is something that's not going to go unnoticed in current times. So I think there's been sort of a two-way street, sort of increased resiliency in the industry as well as increased oversight from the regulatory standpoint.
And just to piggyback on that, there was a policy response too, which is to, put in place a moratorium, right, on new lagoons, and some funding, right, as part of a settlement, to buy out, right, lagoons, and to help farmers make transitions, and those buyout programs, it still exists, and there's still actually demand among a lot of farmers to get bought out and to transition those lagoons and move away from this kind of storage of waste, but there's not enough funding to actually meet the demand for all the people who want to pick that up. But I do, part of the story that Lee just told is that many of the lagoons that were most at risk of pure breaches, right, real just catastrophic failure, had been mitigated by the next set of storms, right? By the time Florence came around. But it doesn't mean that there aren't old lagoons that are still at risk. Those old lagoons, some of them are still at risk of the kind of sort of breaching catastrophic failure. But then a much larger number are spilling over, right? And introducing the sort of, ongoing contamination, but more modest levels of contamination that Lee described. But I do want to point to the fact that there was policy response. That policy response does seem to have addressed kind of, many of the riskiest facilities. It's not complete, and there continues to be risk in storms and ongoing exposure to the pollution from these facilities for neighboring communities. And that continues to be the case.
Thank you both for that. This question is also for both of you, but let's stay with Megan Mullen for a moment. How can better recovery be encouraged? We've all seen photos of the houses on stilts falling into the ocean. Is it enough to build homes higher? Are buyout programs working, like the voluntary program offered by the state of North Carolina? Could you talk about that for a moment?
I mean, that's where it really becomes not a question of recovery from any individual storm, but sustained long-term thinking for communities about what they want their futures to look like. And really what it comes down to is who's getting protected in place through new infrastructure, through new, capacity for protection of properties that are already there, and who gets assistance to relocate. And that's hard thinking, right? That's really difficult decision making. And if we don't engage in it consciously, what happens is the same kind of, pathways of power and influence that exercise themselves through all kinds of local government decision making will continue to do so. And we'll have, expensive homes on well-developed roads getting protected in place, and lower value homes where the infrastructure has for decades been underserved be the ones where we say, oh, it's easier to just move those folks. And so we need to be conscious about the kinds of decisions we're making to create protection for everyone, but in ways that are just and in ways that are equitable. There's some support for buyout programs. There's some demand among homeowners for buyout programs. There's not nearly the kind of financial support to address all those folks who even want the buyouts. And often the buyouts kind of get brought in as an option for homeowners who don't want it. And so making those puzzle pieces fit where it becomes an option for those who are interested, but isn't sort of coerced for those who don't want it. Making those puzzle pieces fit is really important. I think there are lessons to be learned from Charlotte, which has a locally funded buyout program that's been going on for decades, that it sort of operates in a sustained and ongoing way, and not just as part of a FEMA direct response where communities are making rapid decision making and looking at devastation and trying to respond in a minute. I think we can draw lessons from Charlotte. Rocky Mount is another place where there's been sort of longer term decision making about what the physical shape of this community will continue to be going forward. I think this intersects with a lot of what Lee's been talking about, because these low-lying areas have, for their entire histories, been at risk of flooding, right? A lot of these, communities and neighborhoods are in some sense accustomed to flooding. It's part of the history of where they live and their properties, but that flooding's more dangerous now. It's more dangerous because it's deeper, it's longer lasting, and it's carrying these contaminants to a greater degree in higher concentrations at different, periods of time than has been the case historically. The last thing I'd say is on the actual coastline, the destruction of these structures is quite dangerous and is introducing, right, just physical waste onto our shoreline that communities are really going to have to start addressing and grappling with, because then you start to get into intersections with the tourist economy, right? You can't, have people coming to your beach and expect to walk barefoot on the beach when there's rusty nails right on the beach. And this is becoming a real challenge for the oceanfront communities.
Thank you. I have one clarifying question. The buyout program in Charlotte, is that for flooding specifically?
Yeah, it's not just for damaged property, right? So the hazard mitigation program, where FEMA covers, a large chunk of buyout of a buyout expense, and there's a local contribution. Many communities throughout North Carolina have done some buyouts with FEMA support. But it's mitigation money for, post-storm damaged properties. What Charlotte has been doing is, through a stormwater fee, they've developed local capacity for an ongoing buyout program that not only addresses damaged properties post-storm, but also flood-prone properties, and sort of planning stormwater control and stormwater planning, right? And building sort of landscapes for stormwater management in combination with these, with these buyouts. I'm not saying it's perfect. There are challenges and real questions about, again, voluntariness with this, right? Especially when you start buying out apartment buildings where the renters are not the ones making decisions about their fates. It's the property owners. But it is a place we can look to for an example of addressing these questions in an ongoing way and not just post-storm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Lee, same question, but with a twist for you. How can we encourage better cleanup of contaminants after storms? We as a society.
Yeah, I mean, this is the key question. And, I would kind of riff off of some of what Megan just talked about to mention that recovery is expensive and difficult. So actually, the more you can get ahead of this with resilience, the better. So I think that what we really need to be thinking about is certainly we need to be able to recover from major storm events and the contamination events that go along with that. But a better way to start to solve this is to actually build our infrastructure back in a resilient way. And we need to be thinking about this from a climate standpoint, because it becomes quite obvious that extreme storms start to become maybe not the exception, but the norm. And if this is the case, then especially our water and wastewater infrastructure, which of course we manage from sort of a local all the way up to a state standpoint, we need to be able to build this back and sort of armor our infrastructure, our water and wastewater infrastructure against these climate-induced extreme events. And so this can have the effect of reducing the risk of major contamination events during, say, for example, flooding, inundation. A great example is wastewater treatment plants. Wastewater treatment plants are essentially our best defense against waterborne diseases, right? And so we need to be making sure that these wastewater treatment plants, which act as the interface between our waste disposal from a water system into our drinking water supplies, right? We need to make sure that these are built in a way that are armored against, for example, flood inundation. So building these in places that are not subject to, say, overtopped rivers, flooding out the settling basins. This needs to be something we are paying close attention to. Also, the water supplies themselves. So we need to pay close attention to the connections between waste disposal into our waterways and then use of those waterways as drinking water sources. So drinking water treatment plants, we need to be thinking about advanced treatment systems that can protect us not only against the contaminants that we know are there now, but the contaminants we might anticipate from future flooding events and future contamination events. So those are, our major municipal and county and city and state initiatives that we could leverage as we improve our infrastructure. But there's a role for private business and industry as well. We need to make it in those industries and businesses' best interests to store their waste, their hazardous materials, in ways that are less at risk for release. Because of course, these constitute multiple point sources that are very, very difficult to control from a government or municipal standpoint. We need to provide incentives to have resilience at the private level with respect to pollution sources, right? And this extends not only from businesses, but also to individuals. So understanding the risk if we maintain hazardous materials, and those hazardous materials can enter our stormwater systems, both during storms as well as during normal flow systems. So I think it really all comes back to improving our resilience and trying to, sort of intercept that horse before it gets out of the barn, metaphorically speaking.
Thank you. This question is also for both of you, but let's stick with Lee for a moment. Are hurricanes hitting communities that weren't previously affected? And have you seen communities preparing for hurricanes in places where maybe they haven't before?
Well, I mean, I can sort of share an anecdote from my own life. Certainly, when I grew up in South Carolina, and when Hurricane Hugo hit back in, I guess it was 1988 or 1989, I lived in Rock Hill, South Carolina, right south of Charlotte. And of course, that community had never really in recent memory experienced a hurricane before. Suddenly, we're faced with downed trees and being out of power for 2 weeks. And I think this is actually something that has accelerated. So instead of hurricanes being a coastal problem, hurricanes, I think, have become a statewide problem in North Carolina. So we, obviously have seen, I think last year, the major flooding that happened in Western North Carolina due to remnants of hurricanes traveling up the Appalachian Mountains. And I think this is going to become the norm. So we may actually start to see that hurricane impacts and major impacts from these storms extend from coastal states into the interior as the storms get stronger and as the reach of their impacts become more and more. So I think that this has become a wake-up call for municipalities that are not just along the coast. That said, the increased population on the coast of North Carolina presents major challenges because, as we start to build urbanization on and along our coastlines, that actually reduces the resilience of the natural systems there to act as buffers. Okay, so barrier islands that are sort of bulkheaded and have a major amount of urbanization are less effective because they can't move through transport of sand, for example. There aren't the sort of maritime forests that can help serve as a buffer for both contamination as well as storm surge and wind energy. So this is becoming more of a problem for more of our population in the state of North Carolina. And I think that's from a contamination standpoint, as well as from sort of a property and risk to life problem as well.
Thank you. Megan, same question for you. Go ahead.
The biggest change in storm activity for North Carolina is not the frequency of landfalling hurricanes. It's not even the intensity of these hurricanes. It's the rainfall, right? It's the amount of water that these storms contain. And as Lee described, the reach of that water is larger, but the simple quantity of that water is so much more because we're holding more water vapor in the atmosphere. And so the quantity of that water is overwhelming our communities like never before. And then in the coastal plain, we have subsidence, right, from ongoing groundwater depletion. And so we're lowering the land level and making it, creating systems that are retaining water for longer. And so this intensity of flooding is our biggest impact from the changes in storm behavior as a result of climate change. And that impact is reaching more broadly and getting more expensive. It's getting more expensive for communities to clean up. It's getting more expensive for the utilities. It's getting more expensive for the farmers, right, who will lose an entire year of crops, and more expensive for individuals who are experiencing the disruptions from those storms.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the cost. I was wondering, are disaster relief budgets going up? Are they being used effectively? Could you provide some perspective on that?
I can't speak to the size of budgets.
Sure.
I will say that there is, in the last 5 years, there is much more attention in North Carolina to planning, right? And to building sort of more coherence in the state response, creating and staffing the Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Still it's part of public safety, which makes sense, but that also means there's going to be sort of more attention to the recovery and not as much attention to the long-term ongoing planning that we need to be doing. Whether the size of state budgets is larger or smaller, I can't speak to that, but a lot of the investment, right? Think of what Lee described earlier of what needs to happen with these drinking water and wastewater utilities and the stormwater planning. That is just ongoing investment by localities. And so that means, local public officials who need to be willing to incrementally, increase their drinking water service fees to keep pace with inflation so that they can invest in the kind of facilities that are needed to address these risks. And that's not always what we see. What we see is a lot of local officials who don't want to raise costs for their residents. And again, that's understandable. Residents are under a lot of stress. But if we don't raise costs and we don't sort of, pay into funds in an ongoing way, we're not going to build those resilient structures that will help us, protect us when the big storms arrive.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes or so left. Please submit any additional questions you might have. We have another one here. Professor Mullen, let's stick with you. So for an average citizen, just a general member of the public, if you want your community to be resilient and to be preparing for these hurricanes, what can you do?
Be a part of the conversation. There are I'm a political scientist, so I think in politics. And one thing I look to is local newspapers, right? Local newspapers are understaffed, underread, underfinanced, but they're the ones who are kind of keeping tabs on what's going on in city council, in county boards of supervisors, in regional planning agencies, and they're paying attention to the way all of these incremental decisions, a lot of the work of resilience is boring work about planning, right? It's boring work about, infrastructure decisions and capital improvement plans. But pay attention to those things, right? And be a voice in these meetings. There's always an opportunity for public comment, and just showing up and saying, we need to do these things in order to get ready for that storm that's coming down the pipe. Paying attention to that kind of ongoing decision making and being a voice for the planning that needs to happen then gives an incentive for public officials to be doing that planning, right? It gives an incentive for public officials to pay attention and to say, hey, public, we need to raise your fee this modest amount in order so that our drinking water system doesn't collapse when the next storm comes.
Thank you. Lee, earlier you had talked about how individual property owners can be responsible, with the land that they own. Could you talk a little bit more about that in terms of what property owners might be able to do to prevent this flooding and contamination?
Sure. Certainly from a business standpoint, making sure that hazardous materials are stored properly, so in sealed containers that will not basically leak or be sort of discharged during a flooding inundation event, or even sort of making sure that hazardous materials are just out of the way of potential floodwaters. That's one major impact that we can avoid. Also, from a homeowner standpoint, limiting the use of hazardous materials such as pesticides and herbicides, because again, I mentioned that we always are going to have runoff from stormwater under normal circumstances. But what is really unique, as Megan mentioned, when these extreme storm events like hurricanes happen, is this enormous amount of water. And so we get inundation of, say, lawns and gardens and other areas, outbuildings on your property that might not normally be exposed to so much water. And that serves as a potential for mobilization of contaminants. So limiting the uses of known hazardous materials, I think is something that we should all aspire to, both as homeowners as well as business owners. And so I think that can help to alleviate the burdens that are then placed on our infrastructure that's designed to do things like remove waste from stormwater and wastewater before it's discharged into our receiving water. So we all have a role. And it's important, regardless of where we are within the state, because again, the reach of these systems has become just so far.
Thank you. We have one last closing question. Professor Ferguson, let's stay with you for this one. Is North Carolina ready for the next big storm? And if the answer is no, what's your dream scenario? How could we improve things?
Sure. I think we have a long way to go before we would say we're ready for the next big storm. And that's, for a number of reasons. It's very difficult to be ready for something that we just can't necessarily anticipate the scope for. But I do think that we can move in the right direction by increasing, again, the resilience of some of our infrastructure. I think that really the response and the ability to be ready starts with that resilience. I think that certainly the events of the last 5 years have increased the attention that's paid to this problem on the part of, say, the North Carolina DEQ, for example. I think this is the communications, certainly that I've had with DEQ, have increased around storm water and extreme storm pollution problems. And I think that will accelerate. But I think that also, apart from the contamination issues, there's a lot of concern about how the general public can be made more ready for these kinds of events. Certainly, the faster that we can institute evacuations and sort of emergency responses in advance of these storms, the better. And also just the population has to understand that these and take these seriously, that when there are advisories for storms, that this really is a matter not just of property, but also life and death.
Thank you. Same question for you, Professor Mullen. Are we ready for this next big storm?
Well, of course we're not ready, right? And it's hard to even know what being ready means. But I think the thing that I would point to as my top priority is setting up a funding infrastructure so that in that moment in time, when a lot of money is pouring in and a lot of recovery capacity becomes available, that we first make sure that that recovery capacity goes to the communities that are least able to do it for themselves. What happens is the communities that are front in line are the ones that have the local capacity to be front in line, right? That have local, staff on hand and resources on hand and the ability to hire consultants so they know how to, fill out all the forms and file all the permits. And they're the ones who end up first in line to receive recovery aid and start to think about the future, when in fact, what we need to do is look at the ones who are not in line because they don't have the capacity to even get into line. And so that would be my top priority for being ready is thinking about what are we going to do with the money and the recovery systems when this happens, so it doesn't get distributed most easily, but instead gets distributed most equitably. The other part is to, where we have communities that are planning and thinking in these in-between times, try to discipline ourselves to look back at those plans. Try to discipline ourselves to say, what were you going to do with that sewage treatment plant? And can we find a way to do that now instead of just patching it together and doing it in the easiest way? Those would be my two biggest priorities for doing it right.
Those are all excellent points. Thank you to Lee Ferguson and Megan Mullen for your insights. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. As Duke hosts more media briefings in the coming weeks, please like, subscribe, and email dukenews@duke.edu to stay in the loop. Until then, take care, stay dry, and store your hazardous waste properly. Thank you.